Hello, welcome. Mark Satawa, Principal Attorney at Satawa Law, PLLC. And the topic for today's video vlog is shaken baby syndrome, or perhaps maybe the ABCs of shaken baby. What is shaken baby? Or now that the term is falling out of favor because it's BS and junk science, the new term by pediatricians and child abuse directors is abusive head trauma. But what is it? Whether you call it shaken baby or abusive head trauma, it is the idea that absent impact, a child can be shaken violently enough to cause a triad, a set of three symptoms in that child, which frequently results in very serious injury and even death. The first injury, the one most diagnostic of the shaken baby or abusive head trauma syndrome, is subdural hematoma. Hematoma is a bleed beneath the dura covering of the brain, in between basically the covering of the brain and the skull. It's a bleed that starts to create and take up space, and that space puts pressure on the skull and on the brain, and causing very, very serious injury. The second diagnostic symptom that is looked for is what are called retinal hemorrhaging. Again, retinal hemorrhaging being bleeding in the eyes, and frequently diagnostic is bilateral retinal hemorrhaging, meaning retinal hemorrhaging behind both sets of eyes. The third is what's called edema, just simply swelling of the brain. So these three symptoms, subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhaging, and edema, are now, or at least used to be, and maybe we're starting to see the end of this, but traditionally since the 1960s or 70s, have been diagnostic in child abuse hospitals, children's hospitals and child abuse centers located in those hospitals, has been diagnostic of abuse. The medical community has determined that those three things are diagnostic of abuse, in absence of a reasonable explanation by a caregiver as to how they happened. Well, what are the problems with the diagnosis? Well, there are several. The first is that it's referred to in medical circles as a garbage can diagnosis. What that means is this: the clinician, the doctor, checks off the things that it isn't, and if they can't find what it is, then they're left with shaken baby. So the child must be abused. There's nothing diagnostic about it, though. There's nothing that they can look at by itself and say, okay, aha. You know, we see a tumor, you have cancer. We see a break, you must have a broken leg, etc. It's a diagnosis of elimination. You eliminate other things, you're left with abuse. Second, it is not based on science. There was a paper famously written in the 50s about a nurse who allegedly injured a child by shaking it, or a series of children by shaking them. And this syndrome, or this diagnosis, has been built on anecdotal, case-by-case examples of caregivers bringing children into an ER with this set of symptoms, not having an adequate explanation as to how the child got injured, and the medical community opining, well, okay, the child was injured by abuse. So one anecdotal example of abuse has led to a second, a third, 100th, 1,000th. Some people estimate that there are as many as 50,000 people incarcerated in the United States based on this anecdotal pyramid piling on of shaken baby diagnoses. The next problem, and the problem that's really most troubling for those of you facing charges like this, are the fact that it relies upon assumptions to even prove its existence or its validity as a diagnosis. What kind of assumptions am I talking about? So, for example, one of the assumptions is that a child cannot be injured in this manner, that a short distance fall of say less than 5 to 10 feet cannot cause a subdural hematoma in a child. There are studies that show that they can. In fact, there's at least one videotaped incident involving a fall of 18 inches to a carpeted floor from a play structure into a carpeted garage floor where a child developed subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhaging, and edema. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is what's called lucid intervals. The only way they know who to charge with the shaking to begin with is because who was the child with when the child arrested, when the child had a seizure, when the child stopped breathing, when the child arrested, and that person rushes the child to the ER, the medical community says, aha, we know who did it. We know who did it because the child arrested, and it must have happened when that person was the caregiver, when that person was in charge of the child. And that again relies on an assumption that there can't be what's called a lucid interval. There are documented examples of children having lucid intervals as long as 24 to 48 hours following the creation of a subdural hematoma. So if you go from, well, the child must have been injured in the hour before it was brought to the hospital, and the only person taking care of the child within that hour was the mother, the father, the babysitter, the sister, the nanny, the daycare center, whatever, we know who the person must be because there was only one person taking care of the baby during that 1 hour period. But if we take that 1 hour and we assume a lucid interval that takes that 1 hour period to 24 or even 48 hours, now there's potentially 10, 20 people that took care of the child during that time. That's the importance of why they have to try to claim that lucid intervals don't exist when in fact they do. And finally, it assumes that each one of those symptoms happens independently. The problem is that a subdural hematoma, if in fact serious enough, has been shown to cause retinal hemorrhaging and edema because of the swelling and the pressure that puts on the brain. The brain swells, creates the retinal hemorrhaging, it creates the edema. One thing necessarily isn't caught, that they're not necessarily independent of each other. Frequently, the subdural hematoma causing the brain swelling, the edema, can cause the retinal hemorrhaging, and they are not independent, but in fact dependent on each other in many cases. So, what to do? The first thing you can do is that there is a wealth of information out there. You can go to SBS Defense, SBS Shaken Baby Syndrome, sbsdefense.com, where there is a wealth of information. You can Google shaken baby syndrome on the internet and find a wealth of articles and information about the syndrome, pros, cons, and the current debate that goes on about it. After that, you certainly can educate yourself as much as you can by getting your child's medical records, starting with the birth records, even the prenatal care of the children's mother. When were they vaccinated? Was it a vaginal birth or was it a C-section? The latest statistic is that over 70% of vaginal births have some subdural associated with it. Most clear up within 30 days, but we don't know how many do not. You can see if, in retrospect, if there were signs of what's called a chronic subdural, which is an old subdural that has grown over the time. Yet another one of those assumptions I forgot to talk about earlier is that chronic subdurals do not rebleed. In fact, there is all kinds of evidence to show that not only do chronic subdural hematomas rebleed, they often rebleed spontaneously with little or no force needed to cause the subdural to rebleed and again put the baby in distress and cause the baby to seize. So, is there evidence that the child had a chronic subdural that could have been worsening as the time went on, bleeding and causing it more and more pressure as the subdural got bigger and bigger, which ultimately led to the rebleed and the child arresting? Signs of that are a substantial increase in head circumference, vomiting, lethargy, irritability, not eating. Again, the kind of fussiness and irritability that a pediatrician may have dismissed as colic or not handling their formula well can all be signs that the child had been suffering for a chronic subdural that could be weeks, even months old sometimes. Finally, and probably most importantly, go talk to an expert. Go talk to a lawyer who doesn't just need to learn about shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma. Go find someone who does them. We at Satawa Law have been doing shaken baby syndrome, abusive head trauma cases for the better part of the last 2 decades. We have lectured all over the country about these cases, not just in Michigan, but also in Arkansas, in Mississippi, to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Las Vegas, Nevada, in Wisconsin. We are not only state, but national experts in this type of child abuse. They're tough cases. They require a ton of work. They are document intensive. You have to review thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of pages of medical records. You've got to get all the medical records. A very common mistake in these cases is not getting the radiology, the medical images themselves. You can't just rely on what the radiologist said. You need your own expert to review the images to see, was there evidence of a chronic subdural? Is that subdural really a hygroma instead of a hematoma? Is there really evidence of retinal hemorrhaging? And if so, is it truly bilateral? Is there injury to the skull? And quite frankly, is there injury to the neck? It's just common sense that if you can shake a child violently enough to cause a subdural in the baby's head, you should be fracturing, causing severe damage to the baby's neck and spine. These are not easy cases. You need experience, you need expertise, and you need access to doctors, medical experts, biomedical engineers, and other experts to properly beat them. But they can be won. It takes commitment. It takes the right legal team. It takes the right team of experts. And it takes, most of all, you. Because as always, you are your lawyer's best source of information. You're your lawyer's best eyewitness. You're your lawyer's best paralegal. You're your lawyer's best private investigator. Again, you're your lawyer's best source of information. Help your lawyer help you. Compile those records, compile a timeline, compile a list of witnesses, compile a list of events in the baby's life. Get those pediatric records for your child so that your lawyer and the lawyer's experts can truly review your case and offer you the best possible defense and the best possible chance to not only keep your freedom, but the parental rights to your child and your future. I hope you enjoyed today's video vlog. It's Mark Satawa with Satawa Law, and as always, we are on guard defending your rights and protecting your future.